Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Dave's Faves. And today I want to talk about Beethoven's Piano Concertos numbers 1 and 2. They generally come together, or they're thought of together. They kind of belong together. And I know in this day and age, with streaming and whatnot, everything's getting rebroken up. And it ages me because I think in terms of albums. I think in terms of album length or CD length or something like that. And the first two piano concertos tend to go very well on the same disc. And so, I consider them together. I like albums. I like well-planned albums. I like sensible albums, convenient ways to get music. And nowadays with streaming, I'm a little concerned because everything is being rebroken up into tracks or songs, because of the pop music world partly, and partly because that's sort of what the medium does, So anyway, I'm talking about the two of them together. They actually have more in common with each other than, for example, the first two symphonies, which show, I think, a much greater range between the first and the second. Although there's something very interesting about these two works that I like to just throw at you. I just think it's fun to think about. When Beethoven had them published, he knew that number 2 was not as great as number 1. And the reason is because number 2 was actually written quite a bit earlier. The reason that we call it Piano Concerto number 2 is because that's the order of publication, not the order of composition. And when Beethoven was having the second Piano Concerto, which was really the first, published, he sent it to, it was even actually their earlier ones, that have been reconstructed and whatnot. We're not dealing with those. We're talking about the ones Beethoven acknowledged and had published. He wrote to his publisher and said, well, I'm only asking for, such and such a figure, less money for this one, because he sold things in clumps, pieces, and set a price. And he said, because it's really not as good as the other one that you already know about. So I don't want so much money for it. He was trying to get something for it. And I think that's fascinating. I really do. Don't you think it would be an interesting thing if composers today were forced to value what they do in terms of the potential market for a publisher? Can you imagine a composer doing that? Can you imagine a composer saying, well, my second symphony is really not as good as my first symphony, so you can pay me half as much? Of course, in those days, when a publisher bought something, he bought it and owned it. There wasn't any royalty arrangement or anything like that. It was a straight sale, which of course doesn't happen these days. But in a way, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing either. It would certainly force composers, I think, to write differently if they were forced to sell their own work to publishers based on the prospect of performance. That's really something, isn't it? Radical notion. Well, that was the situation that obtained with Beethoven's first two piano concertos. And the second piano concerto, which is really the first, is a relatively immature work. And it sounds it. Beethoven's handling of form is very loose. It's a vehicle for the piano. And the orchestra is kind of along for the ride. And it's delightful. It's full of great tunes. It's full of pianistic virtuosity. What happens, later on is that the virtuosity has more justification for what it's doing. You don't get a sense in Beethoven's later piano concertos, as you quite do in the second, that the pianist is just waiting to take off. He was waiting for the orchestra to stop so that he can do his thing. And I just love the finales of both of these pieces. They have these wonderful syncopated tunes, and I always get them mixed up. I never know which one goes with which. There's da 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 da. It's just a great tune. And then there's da 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 bum bum ba da bum bum ba da 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 bum bum ba da bum bum ba da da. Oh, they're wonderful, wonderful tunes. Both concertos are full of wonderful tunes, and I love them. I really love them. And they are extremely virtuosic pieces. They really show the young Beethoven just saying, ha, watch me do this. Because there are no other piano concertos that we listen to today, frankly. I mean, from that period that have that same degree of just astonishing piano virtuosity. It's really marvelous. I mean, if you listen to them compared to a Mozart piano concerto, you're in a completely different world with respect to piano technique. And so I love them dearly. And the performance that I love dearly is this one, Martha Argerich with Giuseppe Sinopoli and the Philharmonia. Very beautifully recorded. This was a gorgeous recording back in Sinopoli's early days with the Philharmonia when he was making beautiful sounding recordings that weren't too strange, because he got like sort of weirder later. And Argerich is, it's Argerich. It's Argerich in her amazing phase. She's recorded these works over and over again, like she has everything, it seems, and not necessarily for the better, not always worse either, but we don't need multiple versions of this. And Argerich's relationship to the Beethoven piano concertos is very odd because she's never gone past number 3 on disc. And one of the things that I find kind of fascinating is that for years there was a rumor that she had done the Beethoven piano concertos, that she was doing them with Harnoncourt. And that really would have been something, because remember, she did the Schumann concerto with Harnoncourt. And so they thought that there was, I don't know where it came from, but the word was Argerich and Harnoncourt were doing the Beethovens. And then when Harnoncourt actually did them, he did them with Aimard, and not terribly excitingly with Aimard, in my opinion. And I wish that it had been Argerich. That would have been so much fun. But as it is, we have these, and she just plays the daylights out of them. This is the perfect music for her, actually, because it is ebullient and virtuosic and sensitive by turns, and it lets her just turn loose. And Sinopoli, follows her like a hand in a glove. It's really a wonderful, wonderful disc of these two beautiful, youthful, jolly concertos. So I love them. I'll bet you will too. Keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.